What most people misunderstand about avoidance psychology is that it's not a personality flaw in the simple sense. It's an adaptation. It's something that was learned, often very early, in response to emotional environments where closeness didn't feel safe, predictable, or emotionally rewarding. So instead of learning that love is a place of security, the avoidant nervous system learns something very different. Closeness equals risk, dependence equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals potential loss or emotional overwhelm. And here's where it gets important. What looks like emotional independence is often emotional conditioning. The avoidant doesn't start life deciding, I don't need anyone. They arrive at that conclusion through experience. At some point, being open didn't lead to comfort. It led to confusion, inconsistency, or emotional neglect. So the mind does something incredibly intelligent in a survival sense. It builds distance. It creates control. It says, if I don't fully let you in, you can't fully hurt me. But what gets built as protection eventually becomes limitation. Because the same walls that block pain also block intimacy. The same emotional detachment that prevents abandonment also prevents deep connection. And over time, the avoidant individual starts to mistake their own defense mechanisms for identity. I'm just someone who doesn't need much. I'm just more independent. I'm just not emotional like that. But beneath those statements is often a nervous system that has simply learned to suppress instead of process. Now, when someone enters their life who is emotionally present, consistent, and genuinely open, something very subtle but very powerful happens. That person doesn't threaten them physically, but they threaten the structure they've built to feel safe. Because real emotional availability exposes an old contradiction. The avoidant actually does crave connection, but they don't trust what it costs. So they begin to experience closeness as internal pressure. Not because it is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar always feels like danger to a system built on emotional survival. That's why avoidants can sometimes seem calm on the surface while internally they are highly activated. They are not reacting to you as a person. They are reacting to what you awaken inside them. And this is where most people misinterpret the dynamic. They think, if I just love harder, prove more, stay longer, they'll finally feel safe. But avoidance doesn't respond to intensity. It responds to safety through distance. The more pressure there is for emotional merging, the more the avoidance system pulls back to regain equilibrium. So at its core, avoidance psychology is not a lack of capacity for love. It is a conflict between the desire for love and the fear of what love has historically cost them. One part of them leans in, and another part of them shuts down the moment it becomes real enough to matter. And until that internal conflict is understood, every relationship becomes a battlefield between connection and self-protection. Because the avoidant isn't running from you. They are running from the version of themselves that only appears when love finally gets close enough to feel real. And that is the real wound. Loving someone feels like danger when it should feel like home. What happens next is where most people get confused because they assume emotional security should automatically create emotional comfort. But with an avoidance system, that's not always how it plays out. In fact, your stability can become the very thing that unsettles them the most. Think about it this way. If someone has spent years in emotional unpredictability, hot and cold affection, inconsistent attention, or relationships where love had to be earned, then their nervous system doesn't calibrate around peace. It calibrates around intensity. So when you enter their life with consistency, clarity, and emotional availability, you are introducing something their system is not trained to interpret as safe. Not because it is unsafe, but because it is unfamiliar. And the mind often mistrusts what it has never learned to survive with. So your calm presence doesn't just feel like love to them, it feels like exposure. Because stability removes the chaos they are used to hiding inside. In chaos, they can focus outward. They can analyze, react, withdraw, return, repeat. But in stability, there is nowhere to hide internally. Your consistency creates a kind of emotional stillness that forces awareness. And awareness is exactly what avoidant structures are built to avoid. This is why they can sometimes seem emotionally distant even when nothing bad is happening. You didn't create conflict, but your presence creates clarity. And clarity can feel like pressure when someone is not used to sitting with their own emotional reality. And here's the deeper layer most people miss. You don't feel too much for them because you are overwhelming them. You feel too real. There's a difference. Too much would imply excess, intensity beyond capacity. But what often happens is the opposite. You are consistent enough that they can no longer justify their avoidance. You are emotionally steady enough that their old patterns stop working. And when coping strategies stop working, discomfort rises. So instead of leaning into you, they start to feel an internal pull to restore distance. Not because they don't value you, but because distance restores their sense of control. In their internal world, control equals safety, and emotional closeness equals unpredictability. This is also why avoidants often experience a strange internal contradiction during healthy connection. One part of them feels drawn in, calm, seen, even comforted, and another part becomes hyper-aware, scanning for reasons to step back, to detach, to regain emotional space. It's not manipulation. It's regulation. They are trying to manage an emotional system that has not learned how to stay open without feeling overwhelmed. So your stability doesn't create rejection. It creates confrontation. It confronts their learned belief that love must come with tension, effort, or uncertainty to be real. And when that belief is challenged, the nervous system doesn't immediately upgrade its understanding. It resists. That resistance is what you experience as distance, hesitation, or sudden withdrawal in moments where everything actually feels fine to you. But what's really happening is this. You are the first consistent emotional experience they may have had that doesn't match their internal blueprint of love. And anything that doesn't match the blueprint has to be reevaluated before it can be trusted. So your presence doesn't destabilize them because it is wrong. It destabilizes them because it is rewriting what they thought love had to feel like. And that is the quiet revolution you trigger in their psychology, not chaos returning, but peace becoming undeniable and therefore unavoidable. What most people misread in avoidant dynamics is the push and pull. They see it as inconsistency, confusion, or emotional immaturity. But if you look at it through a psychological lens, it's not confusion at all. It's conflict. Two competing systems running at the same time inside the same person. On one side, there is the human need for connection. This is not optional. It's built into the nervous system. We are wired for bonding, for attachment, for emotional resonance with another person. So when an avoidant meets someone they genuinely care about, that system activates. There is attraction, comfort, curiosity, even a sense of emotional grounding that they don't always know how to name. But on the other side, there is the protection system. And this system is just as powerful, just as automatic, and often much louder when intimacy increases. This part of them is not asking, do I like this person? It is asking, is this safe for me long term? What could I lose here? What could hurt me if I stay open? And these two systems do not cooperate smoothly. They compete. So what you see externally, the texting patterns, the emotional closeness followed by sudden distance, the moments of warmth followed by withdrawal, is actually the surface expression of an internal negotiation that never fully resolves. When they feel connected, the attachment system is in control. They lean in, they engage. They may even express deep emotion, sometimes more than expected. But as soon as the emotional bond strengthens beyond a certain threshold, the protection system activates. Not because something is wrong, but because something feels significant enough to risk loss. And significance is exactly what triggers fear. So they pull back. They create distance. They rationalize. They overthink. They suddenly become busy, uncertain, or emotionally unavailable. And to the person on the receiving end, it feels like rejection. But internally, it feels like regulation. They are trying to bring their nervous system back to baseline. This is why the push-pull cycle is so powerful and so misunderstood. It is not a game. It is not intentional manipulation. It is the body attempting to manage two opposing truths at the same time. I want closeness, and closeness has hurt me before. And when those two truths collide, the nervous system doesn't choose logic. It chooses protection first. Now here's where it becomes even more complex. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the stronger both systems activate. So instead of settling into stability, the cycle intensifies. Closeness feels more rewarding and therefore more risky. Distance feels more relieving and therefore more necessary. This creates a rhythm that feels addictive for both people, but for very different reasons. The avoidant becomes caught in a loop of approaching and retreating, not because they are uncertain about you, but because they are uncertain about what emotional safety actually feels like when it is sustained. And that uncertainty is exhausting for them too. Many avoidants don't experience peace in either state for long. Too close feels overwhelming. Too distant feels empty. So they oscillate, trying to find a middle point that doesn't yet exist in their internal wiring. This is also why emotional logic rarely works in these moments. You cannot prove safety into existence for someone whose nervous system equates intimacy with risk. You cannot argue them out of a survival response. Because in those moments, you are not dealing with their reasoning mind. You are dealing with their conditioned reflexes. So the push-pull cycle is not the problem itself. It is the symptom of an unresolved internal contradiction, the desire to love fully and the fear of what love has historically cost them. And until that contradiction is healed from within, no amount of external consistency can permanently stabilize the cycle. Because the real battle is not between you and them. It is between closeness that heals and closeness that once hurt, and neither side is willing to fully let go yet. There is a moment in avoidance psychology that most people never recognize while it's happening, but it is absolutely pivotal. It's the moment when someone enters their emotional world who doesn't match their internal template of love. Because up until that point, most avoidant individuals have built their understanding of relationships through repetition, predictable patterns of inconsistency, emotional distance, or situations where closeness was conditional. So over time, they don't just learn behaviors, they learn expectations. They develop an internal blueprint of what love looks like, what it costs, and how long it usually lasts before it becomes unsafe or unavailable. And then you appear, not as chaos, not as unpredictability, but as consistency, emotional presence, steady communication, clear intention, and most importantly, a kind of emotional availability that doesn't fluctuate based on their behavior. And this is where something subtle but profound begins to happen. At first, you don't just feel like a person to them. You feel like a reference point, a comparison, a mirror they didn't expect to look into. Because your emotional steadiness highlights something they may not have consciously examined before, that love can exist without volatility. That connection can be present without confusion. That someone can care without forcing pursuit. And that realization is not always comforting. For an avoidant nervous system, consistency can feel unfamiliar enough to become emotionally disorienting. Not because it is unsafe, but because it doesn't match the internal map they have been using to navigate relationships. So instead of immediate trust, there is often a period of observation, testing, subtle emotional distance. Not to push you away, but to measure whether what they are experiencing is stable or temporary. But beneath that surface process, something deeper is unfolding. They are not just reacting to you, they are comparing you unconsciously to everything they have known before. And in that comparison, a quiet truth begins to form. This is different. Not necessarily better in a simple emotional sense, but structurally different. Healthier, more grounded, less reactive. And that difference creates internal tension. Because if you are the first consistent emotional experience they have encountered in a meaningful way, then you are also the first person to challenge the belief that love must come with uncertainty. You are the first to demonstrate that emotional safety doesn't have to be earned through distance or struggle. And that kind of realization doesn't just change perception, it disrupts identity. This is why you often become unforgettable to them even when they pull away. Not because of intensity, but because of contrast. You stand out against everything that came before you. And contrast is what the brain encodes most deeply when it comes to emotional memory. So even in absence, your presence lingers psychologically. Not as obsession in a superficial sense, but as unfinished recalibration. Their internal system has been introduced to a new model of connection, but it has not yet decided how to fully integrate it. And that's why avoidants often oscillate after meeting someone like you. They move away not because they didn't recognize something valuable, but because recognizing it requires them to rethink everything they assumed about emotional safety. And that kind of rethinking takes time, discomfort, and internal restructuring. So you are not just another relationship in their story. You are the first real comparison point between the love they adapted to and the love they didn't know was possible. And once that comparison exists, nothing stays psychologically the same again. Because some people don't just enter your life. They rewrite the standard your nervous system has been using to define what love is supposed to feel like. What often looks like emotional cruelty in avoidant behavior is, in many cases, emotional defense taken to an unconscious extreme. When they withdraw, criticize, devalue, or suddenly become distant, most people interpret it as rejection. But psychologically, it's more accurate to understand it as preemptive protection. Because in their internal world, closeness is never just closeness. It carries weight. It carries risk. It carries memory. So when intimacy starts to deepen, when emotional attachment becomes real, when consistency starts to form, the avoidance system doesn't just experience connection. It experiences vulnerability rising in real time. And vulnerability for them is not neutral. It is charged. So what happens next is a defensive reflex that has been rehearsed over years, sometimes decades. Instead of waiting for potential pain to arrive, the system tries to neutralize it early. If I detach first, I won't be abandoned. If I criticize first, I won't feel surprised later. If I create distance first, I regain control of the emotional field. From the outside, this can look like sudden coldness. It can look like emotional withdrawal without explanation. It can look like someone pulling away right when things were going well. But internally, it feels like stabilization, like regaining balance after emotional intensity. And this is where the misunderstanding deepens. Because the person on the receiving end is often giving more, opening more, investing more. They interpret closeness as safety building. So when withdrawal happens, it creates confusion. Why now? We were fine. But the avoidant nervous system is not responding to the present moment alone. It is responding to the accumulation of emotional significance. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the more activated their protection system becomes. Not because the relationship is failing, but because it is succeeding. So the attack is rarely about you as a person. It is about what closeness awakens inside them. Sometimes it shows up as subtle criticism, small comments that create emotional distance. Sometimes it shows up as emotional minimization, downplaying what they previously expressed. Sometimes it shows up as complete withdrawal, where communication suddenly drops and emotional access is cut off. But underneath all of it is the same mechanism: regain control before emotional exposure deepens. Now here's what makes this even more complex. Avoidant individuals are often highly perceptive. They can sense emotional intensity in others very quickly. They can feel expectation, attachment, and emotional dependency building. And when they feel that, even if it is unspoken, their internal alarm system begins to activate. Not because the other person is doing something wrong, but because emotional dependence signals potential loss of autonomy. And autonomy for them is tied directly to safety. So they strike first emotionally, not with intention to harm, but with intention to reduce intensity. They unconsciously try to lower the emotional temperature of the relationship so they can breathe again internally. But what they don't realize is that in doing so, they often create the very thing they are trying to avoid: real emotional distance. Because the other person, feeling rejected or confused, either withdraws or pursues harder. And both responses intensify the cycle. The more you pursue, the more pressure they feel. The more you withdraw, the more unresolved emotional tension builds inside them. So the relationship becomes a loop of protection and reaction. One person trying to secure connection, the other trying to secure safety, and neither fully realizing that both are operating from fear, just expressed in opposite directions. This is why avoidant attacks are not signs of lack of care. In many cases, they are signs that care has become significant enough to trigger fear. And fear, when unprocessed, does not communicate softly. It communicates through distance, shutdown, and emotional disruption. But the paradox is this: the very behavior meant to protect them from loss often becomes the reason loss occurs. And that's the hidden tragedy of avoidant defense systems. They are not trying to destroy connection. They are trying to survive it without being overwhelmed by it. And until that internal fear is understood and regulated, love will always feel like something that must be managed rather than something that can simply be lived. At some point in every avoidant dynamic, something shifts, but not because you force it, not because you explain it better, and not because you finally find the right words. It shifts because emotional reality becomes undeniable through experience, not argument. And that experience is usually created when you stop overfunctioning in the relationship. For a long time, many people in these dynamics fall into a pattern of overgiving, over-explaining, over-chasing, and over-adapting. It comes from a powerful place: the desire to be understood, to be chosen, to restore connection. But psychologically, what it often does is create an uneven emotional structure where one person becomes the pursuer and the other becomes the regulator of distance. And in that structure, the avoidance system doesn't feel the full impact of their own absence. Because no matter how much they withdraw, something or someone is still emotionally holding the line. So the nervous system never gets the chance to fully register consequence. But when you stop chasing, not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as emotional self-regulation, something important changes in the dynamic. The emotional environment becomes balanced again. The pressure drops. The pursuit stops filling the space where uncertainty used to be managed for them. And that's where silence becomes powerful. Because silence, when it is grounded and not reactive, does something words cannot do. It removes stimulation. It removes reassurance. It removes the invisible cushion that allowed avoidance to remain unchallenged. And in that absence, the avoidant individual is no longer interacting with your effort. They are left alone with their own emotional experience. For the first time, there is nothing external managing the emotional consequences of distance. And this is where reflection begins. Not immediately, not comfortably, and not always consciously at first, but slowly the emotional system starts to register a gap. The usual dynamic is gone. The usual pursuit-response cycle is gone. And what remains is the echo of connection without its usual regulation. And that echo is where awareness forms. Because now they are not just experiencing your presence, they are experiencing your absence without compensation. And absence, when it is no longer filled, becomes information. It tells the nervous system what has been removed, what is no longer accessible, and what is no longer being reinforced. This is the moment where emotional accountability starts to emerge, even if it is subtle. They begin to remember not just how they felt when you were present, but what your presence stabilized in them. The consistency, the emotional grounding, the difference between chaos and calm that they may not have fully appreciated while it was available. And here's the deeper psychological truth. People don't always value what they have in real time when their nervous system is still adjusting to it. Value often becomes clear through contrast, through removal, through distance, through silence. But this is not about creating loss to trigger realization. It is about removing distortion so reality can be seen clearly. Because when you are constantly pursuing, the relationship becomes about managing your pursuit. When you step back, the relationship becomes about experiencing your absence. And in that space, the avoidant individual is no longer reacting to pressure. They are confronting emotional truth without interference. And that confrontation is where internal change either begins or is avoided entirely. For some, it leads to clarity. For others, it leads to further distancing. But either way, it reveals something essential, whether the connection was being engaged with consciously or only maintained through emotional imbalance. So this turning point is not about strategy. It is about restoration of equilibrium. It is about allowing emotional consequences to be felt instead of constantly softened. And it is about recognizing that real connection cannot exist where one person is always compensating for another person's avoidance. Because love that is real does not require one person to disappear for the other to finally see clearly. It requires both people to be emotionally present enough to feel what is actually there, not what is being managed around it. And in that moment of absence, the truth becomes simple, direct, and unavoidable. What was real will begin to reveal itself, and what was dependent on imbalance will begin to fade. And when you step back and see the full picture of avoidant psychology, you realize something important. This was never just about one person running and another person chasing. It was always about two nervous systems trying to survive love in completely different ways. One learned that closeness could overwhelm, so it built distance as protection. The other learned that love had to be held onto, so it built pursuit as safety. And for a time, those two strategies collide in the same story, creating confusion, intensity, and emotional exhaustion on both sides. But here is the deeper truth most people miss. Awareness changes everything. Because once you understand what is really happening underneath the behavior, you stop taking it personally in the same way. You stop confusing fear with lack of love. You stop confusing distance with lack of value. And you stop confusing emotional shutdown with emotional truth. You begin to see patterns instead of just pain. And in that awareness, something powerful shifts inside you. You no longer feel the need to over-explain your worth to someone who is still learning how to feel safe with closeness. You no longer abandon yourself in order to keep someone else from leaving. And you no longer confuse emotional chaos with emotional depth. Instead, you return to something much stronger, clarity. Because real emotional strength is not chasing someone into understanding you. Real emotional strength is standing in your truth without shrinking it, without chasing validation, and without losing yourself in someone else's fear. And ironically, that is often the exact moment everything changes in the dynamic. Not because you applied pressure, but because you removed imbalance. Not because you demanded clarity, but because you embodied it. Some people will meet your absence and finally understand your value. Others will meet it and continue running from what they are not ready to face within themselves. And both outcomes give you something important, truth. Because at the end of the day, love is not meant to be a constant battlefield between fear and pursuit. It is meant to be a space where two people can be fully present without needing to protect themselves from each other. And if that space cannot exist, then what you are experiencing is not a failure of love. It is a reflection of readiness. So the final lesson is simple but powerful. You were never meant to fight for someone's ability to stay present. You were meant to become someone who no longer loses themselves in the process of waiting for it.